Greetings YouTube, Jason here with my first instructional video, or informational video I guess, on 5 tips for learning Japanese. Now just to give you a little background on me, I started studying Japanese when I was 16 in high school, and I'm 43 now, almost 44, so it pains me to do the math on that, but it's been a long time. So I have quite a solid background in this, and I've talked to Japanese people regularly through that whole time. So I know real Japanese every day, real spoken Japanese. So I think you'll be able to find some good bits of information here. All right, so tip number 1, try not to use the word Anata. Or a better way to say this would be maybe beware of the use of the word Anata. So Anata just means you, just like in English we have that word, right? But it has a different nuance in Japanese. I'll never forget, years ago I was talking to a young Japanese teacher. I think she was about 30 years old. And she said, I just think the word Anata is kind of rude. And I said, rude? Really? Why? I mean, what word are you supposed to use when you're referring to the other person? And she said, well, just use the person's name. So like Jason-san or Miyuki-san or whatever the person's name is. So I said, oh, okay. So then years later, I decided to ask another Japanese friend of mine who spoke fluent English and Japanese, of course, and I knew that I could get a good explanation if one was needed. And so I asked, her. I said, "Hey, what's the scoop with this word?" And she said, "Well, it's not that it's rude, but she said it has a sort of a cold, distant kind of nuance to it." So she said impersonal, I guess was the word I was looking for. So if you're talking to people who are a lot older than you, or you're talking to like coworkers or acquaintances or something, then Anata would be appropriate. But if you're talking to like friends, close friends and family, then she said it would definitely not be a word that you'd want to use because it just seems kind of distant and unfriendly. So anyway, so that's the scoop on that. And actually one really kind of interesting twist about this word, which seems very counterintuitive after everything I've just told you about it, it kind of means the opposite, or has the opposite sort of connotation when you're talking about people who are in a relationship or who are married and they say Anata to one another. Then it means kind of like dear, sweetie, honey, that kind of thing. So anyway, kind of an interesting piece of info about that word. All right, tip number 2, forget formal textbook Japanese. Okay, now I don't mean literally forget it. You still need to know it, but it's not used in conversation. I remember about 20 years ago, I had been studying Japanese for a fair amount of time and spoke it quite well. And I went into a chat room in AOL back when AOL was still, kind of a big thing, and they actually had chat rooms. And it was a Japanese chat room, and I'm looking at all these people, of course they're writing in Japanese, and I just did not understand hardly any of what they were saying. And so I wrote in there in English. I said, "What language are you guys using? I don't understand most of this." And someone replied back and said, "Oh, this is Japanese. This is spoken, everyday Japanese." And I said, "Wow!" So that really kind of opened my eyes. When I went to school years ago, my teacher she was in her early 50s at the time, so she was kind of old school, Japanese, and so she always taught us formal, polite Japanese, and which wouldn't have been so bad, but she never even mentioned that there was this whole other side to Japanese, this informal side to Japanese. And so yeah, I mean it's a pretty big deal. And I remember I was talking to a Japanese coworker about 10 years ago when I worked at Hewlett Packard, and she said, "Yeah, your Japanese is very good, but it's too formal. We never talk like this in conversation." And I said, "Really? Even though I just met you and stuff?" And she said, "Well, maybe the first time you meet somebody, but not after that, really." And she's like, "It's okay for you to use that if you don't know any better, but you're never going to actually hear that in conversation. So you need to be able to at least recognize informal Japanese." So yeah, really interesting there. So for those of you who aren't clear on what that constitutes formal versus informal Japanese. For instance, like mostly it's in verb conjugation. Taberu versus tabemasu, or yomu versus yomimasu, that kind of thing. So I'll talk more about that in another video probably. But anyway, that's the scoop on tip number 2. All right, tip number 3. Study different dialects. Now, this at first glance might seem kind of difficult to do, but it's actually not all that bad. There's a couple of really good books out there on different Japanese dialects, or what they call Kansai Japanese. Kansai is a region in Japan, and that area is made up of quite a few different dialects that they have, like Osaka and Nara and a bunch of other areas that each area has their own little flavor, their own little differences in both vocabulary and grammar. So it's really interesting. And when you'll hear these different dialects used a lot is in the movies. They use these all the time in movies. Probably a Japanese person won't use one of these dialects with you if you as a foreigner, because they're going to assume that you don't know what these words mean, or you don't know those dialects. But yeah, if you use it with them, oh my God, they will think you are the greatest person on earth. They will be so absolutely touched and impressed that you wanted to learn one of their dialects, especially if you're talking to somebody in their own like hometown dialect. Man, they will just think you are unbelievably awesome. So it's kind of interesting. The dialects, there's a couple really good books on the subject. I will either post those links in the description, or I will talk about them in another video at some point. But the information is out there, and it's pretty interesting. The grammar changes, and the even they have their own vocabulary and everything. So pretty cool stuff. All right. Next tip. Tip number 4. Get a pen pal and or a language exchange partner. This is so important. You can't learn Japanese if you're not talking to Japanese people. Or you can, but it'll make it like 5 times more difficult. Get a pen pal. Get a language exchange partner, like on Skype. God bless Skype and similar programs. I wish they had that when I first started out, because it would have made things so much easier. And just get used to writing in Japanese, every day, or even several times a week, or talking to your Japanese friend once a week on Skype or something. Makes a huge difference. And I want to make something very clear here about how big of a difference this can make. I had a good Japanese friend, and he speaks fluent English. And when I first met him, I said, so I assume you've lived in the United States, or something, because you speak English so well. And he said, no, I've never even been to the United States. And I said, really? How'd you learn to speak it so well? And he said, Skype. He said, I made it my job for 8 hours, 6 hours or 8 hours a day, since I knew that I wanted to come to the United States to work and study. That was my job, to learn English. And so he forced himself to talk to people on Skype, every day, or at least 3-4 times a week, and just study like crazy. And I got to tell you, this guy, he spoke it. I mean, he had an accent, but he spoke it fluently. I mean, he could understand pretty much anything that I said. So it takes a lot of discipline to do that, but it can be done. Just want you to realize that. All right. Next tip, last tip, tip number 5, and this is a big one. Make Japanese a part of your daily life. So this is kind of comprised of 3 different little mini sections. First one is journal in Japanese. So every single day, and this is really easy to do, just make it a point to like write yourself on whatever word processor you're using on your computer, or just in a handwritten notebook or whatever. Just write about your day. Write about what you did that day, or things that happened. Even if you have nothing huge to write about. Write about the weather. Did you talk to anybody? Did you see any of your friends? Did you go anywhere? All these things. I mean, because you'll find that, of course, daily activities are fairly repetitious. I mean, you're going to do similar things every day. You're not going to do. There's going to be certain things that, of course, you only do once in a while, but there's going to be a lot of things that you do every day, and so you'll start to build up these words, your vocabulary, and different grammatical structures that you're using because you're using these things every day. Really helpful. Second thing, talk to yourself in Japanese. Now, this one probably won't be done at the beginning because you're going to be more likely to make a mistake that you won't catch. So I recommend at the beginning to do the journaling thing. That way you can double check it later, or you can have one of your Japanese friends or your Japanese teacher double check it. Okay. But after you're sort of to the point where you're able to talk to yourself in simple sentences, start talking to yourself. Just say, little things. I'm watching TV. I'm about to eat dinner. I just woke up from a nap. Whatever it is, just force yourself to do this. Now, this is one of those things that I wish I had done a little earlier in my Japanese study, because I got used to and really good at writing and reading Japanese, but I wasn't nearly as good at talking and listening. And so eventually I started doing this, but I realized, man, when you're under the gun, and this is something you'll particularly notice when you're talking on Skype. You don't have a minute or two to think about what you want to say like you do when you're writing it, right? You're writing it by yourself. You don't have any time limit, but when you're talking to yourself, your brain has to work quicker. So anyway, that's the scoop on that. Sorry, my cat was coming over here wanting to be petted. So okay, and the last thing in this subject, and we kind of touched on this before, is use email and Skype. Again, big deal. There's a lot of good sites out there that will let you contact pen pals, and I'll talk about that in another video, where I think I'm going to talk about my top resources for learning Japanese. But absolutely, email a friend every day, or 3-4 times a week, or do like I did. Sometimes email 2-3 people in a day, because again, a lot of the things that you're going to be telling your friends kind of the same things, right? But that repetition is going to be where you really start to learn the vocabulary and the grammatical structures. So these are really important to do. All right. So I think that's it. Those are my 5 tips for learning Japanese. I hope that you've got some use out of this, and like I said, I will be doing other videos in the near future on top resources for learning Japanese, among other things. If you do have any requests or any comments, please let me know, and I will be happy to address those. And I will talk to you soon. Thanks for listening.